At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law Grace whispered in my ear, "Now that the old fool is dead, I am taking everything." "You will get nothing, you pathetic old woman." I smiled and said, "We will see about that, dear." What I did next changed everything forever. Let me tell you what really happened. But first, thank you for watching my stories. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe and tell us what city you are watching from in the comments. We love connecting with our viewers. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Natalie and I am 72 years old. I was married to my beloved husband Benjamin for 48 beautiful years. Benjamin was the kind of man who made everyone around him feel special. He had built a successful construction company from nothing, working 16-hour days with his bare hands until he became one of the most respected builders in our town. We lived in a gorgeous Victorian house that Benjamin had restored himself, complete with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch where we spent countless evenings talking about our dreams. The house sat on 5 acres of prime land, right in the heart of town, worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. Our son Alexander was 38 years old, a successful lawyer who had inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's compassionate heart. Alexander had always been our pride and joy, graduating top of his class from law school and building his own practice, helping families navigate difficult legal situations. He was everything we could have hoped for in a son. 3 years ago, Alexander married Grace, a stunning 28-year-old woman with platinum blonde hair and emerald green eyes that, the first time I met Grace, she was wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people make in a month, and she carried herself like she owned the world. From the very beginning, something felt wrong about Grace. She would smile sweetly at family gatherings, but her eyes remained calculating and cold. When she thought no one was looking, I caught her examining our antique furniture, counting the silverware, and asking Alexander pointed questions about his inheritance. Grace came from money, or at least she claimed she did. She told elaborate stories about growing up on a horse farm in Kentucky, attending private boarding schools, and traveling through Europe every summer. But whenever I asked specific questions about her family or her past, she would change the subject or give vague answers that never quite added up. During their engagement, Grace insisted on the most expensive wedding our town had ever seen. She rented out the entire country club, hired a celebrity wedding planner from the city, and demanded that every detail be absolutely perfect. The wedding cost more than Benjamin and I had spent on our first house, but Alexander was so in love that he would have given her the moon if she had asked for it. After the wedding, Grace moved into our family with the confidence of someone who belonged there, but she never quite fit. She would criticize the way I cooked traditional family recipes, suggesting that we hire a chef instead. She complained that our house was too old-fashioned and needed complete renovation with modern amenities and smart home technology. Most troubling of all, Grace seemed determined to drive a wedge between Alexander and his father. She would make subtle comments about how Benjamin was holding Alexander back from his true potential. She suggested that the construction company was beneath someone with Alexander's education and that he should be focusing on more prestigious legal work. Benjamin noticed these changes in our family dynamic, but he was too kind-hearted to say anything directly. He would ask me privately if I thought Grace was happy in our family, and I could see the worry in his eyes. Benjamin loved Alexander so much that he wanted to believe Grace was good for him, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. The situation became more concerning when Grace started showing unusual interest in Benjamin's business affairs. She would ask detailed questions about property values, construction contracts, and the company's financial situation. When Benjamin mentioned updating his will, Grace became extremely attentive, asking about estate planning and inheritance laws with the intensity of someone studying for a test. 6 months ago, Benjamin started feeling sick. At first, it seemed like normal aging, occasional fatigue, and some digestive issues that he dismissed as stress from work. But over the weeks, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He lost weight, became increasingly weak, and developed a persistent cough that would not go away. I begged Benjamin to see a doctor, but he kept insisting that he just needed rest. Grace, surprisingly, supported his decision to avoid medical treatment, suggesting that doctors were just trying to make money off elderly patients. She even offered to help care for him at home, preparing his meals and bringing him herbal remedies that she claimed were better than prescription medications. As Benjamin grew sicker, Grace became more attentive to him, spending hours sitting by his bedside and helping him with daily tasks. Alexander was grateful for her dedication, praising her for being such a caring daughter-in-law. I wanted to appreciate her help, but something about her behavior made me uncomfortable. Grace insisted on being present for every conversation about Benjamin's condition, his business affairs, and his estate planning. She would take detailed notes and ask specific questions about asset distribution, power of attorney arrangements, and beneficiary designations. When I suggested that these were private family matters, Grace would remind me that she was family now and had a right to be involved in important decisions. 3 weeks before Benjamin died, something happened that should have been a warning sign. I found Grace in Benjamin's study at 3 a.m, going through his desk drawers with a flashlight. When I asked what she was doing, she claimed she was looking for his insurance information because she was worried about his medical coverage. She had keys to every drawer, keys that Benjamin had never given to anyone except me. The next morning, Benjamin mentioned that some of his important documents seemed to be out of place. His will, his business contracts, and his financial statements had all been moved slightly from where he normally kept them. When I told him about finding Grace in his study, he looked troubled, but said that she was probably just trying to help organize his affairs. 2 weeks before Benjamin passed away, Grace suggested that he should update his will to reflect recent changes in tax laws. She had researched estate planning extensively and insisted that his current will was outdated and potentially problematic for the family. Grace even recommended a specific lawyer, someone she had found who specialized in complex estate situations. Benjamin was too sick to meet with the lawyer in person, so Grace arranged for the attorney to come to our house. I was not invited to participate in this meeting, which Grace explained was necessary to avoid potential conflicts of interest. Alexander was also excluded, which Grace said was standard practice to ensure the will reflected Benjamin's true wishes rather than family pressure. During the week before Benjamin died, Grace became his primary caregiver, managing his medications, preparing his meals, and limiting his visitors to avoid overwhelming him. She told concerned friends and relatives that Benjamin needed complete rest and could not handle the stress of social interactions. Even I was restricted in how much time I could spend with my own husband. On Benjamin's last day, Grace was the only one with him when he passed away. She claimed that his death was peaceful and that his final words were about how grateful he was for her care. Alexander was devastated that he had not been present for his father's last moments. But Grace assured him that Benjamin had died, knowing how much his family loved him. The funeral was a beautiful service that celebrated Benjamin's life and his contributions to our community. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, sharing stories about how Benjamin had helped them, employed them, or simply been a friend when they needed one. Alexander delivered a moving eulogy about his father's legacy and the values he had instilled in our family. Throughout the funeral service, Grace played the role of the grieving daughter-in-law perfectly. She wore an elegant black dress and carried herself with appropriate solemnity, accepting condolences with gracious dignity. She held Alexander's hand supportively and even comforted me when I became emotional during the service. After the burial, we gathered at our house for a traditional reception where friends and family could share memories and support each other through this difficult time. Grace was an excellent hostess, making sure everyone felt welcome and had everything they needed. She seemed genuinely committed to helping our family through this period of grief. But as the last guests were leaving, Grace's demeanor changed completely. She waited until Alexander was outside saying goodbye to his colleagues, then approached me with a cold smile that I had never seen before. She leaned close to my ear, close enough that no one else could hear, and delivered the words that would change everything. Now that the old fool is dead, I am taking everything. You will get nothing, you pathetic old woman. The words hit me like a physical blow, but something inside me refused to show weakness. Instead of crying or getting angry, I looked Grace directly in the eyes and smiled my sweetest grandmother smile. "We will see about that, dear," I replied calmly. Grace looked surprised by my reaction. She had expected tears, panic, or rage, but I gave her nothing but serene confidence. I could see confusion flash across her face as she tried to understand why I was not devastated by her threat. That night, after everyone had gone home and Alexander had returned to his own house, I sat alone in the kitchen where Benjamin and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations. The house felt empty without his presence, but I knew that Benjamin would want me to protect our family and preserve the legacy he had worked so hard to build. I made myself a cup of tea and started thinking carefully about Grace's behavior over the past few months. Her sudden interest in estate planning, her insistence on being involved in private financial discussions, her convenient discovery of legal expertise, and her complete control over Benjamin during his final weeks, all painted a disturbing picture. The more I considered the timeline of events, the more suspicious everything became. Benjamin had been healthy and active until Grace started providing his meals and medications. His rapid decline coincided perfectly with her increased involvement in his care. The timing of the will revision, just weeks before his death, was incredibly convenient for someone who might benefit from changes to his estate plans. I realized that if Grace had somehow manipulated Benjamin's will in her favor, she would inherit everything, leaving Alexander and me with nothing. But I also knew that Benjamin was far too smart and too protective of his family to make such a drastic change without good reason. There had to be more to this story than Grace's threat suggested. Over the next few days, I began conducting my own investigation into Grace's background and her recent activities. I started by calling some of Benjamin's business associates and longtime friends, asking casual questions about their interactions with Grace during Benjamin's illness. What I learned was troubling and confirmed my growing suspicions. Benjamin's longtime attorney, Morris, told me that Benjamin had never contacted him about updating his will. In fact, Morris had not spoken to Benjamin in over a year, and their last conversation had been about adding a codicil to ensure that I would be financially secure if Benjamin died first. This directly contradicted Grace's claim about necessary updates to the will. Benjamin's accountant, Patricia, revealed that someone had been asking detailed questions about the construction company's value and Benjamin's personal assets. This person had claimed to be researching estate planning options for the family, but Patricia had found the questions oddly specific and somewhat inappropriate for a daughter-in-law to be asking. Most disturbing of all, Benjamin's doctor, James, told me that Benjamin had never been his patient. Despite Benjamin's obvious illness during his final months, he had never sought medical treatment or received any official diagnosis. Grace had told everyone that Benjamin was under medical care, but this was apparently another lie. As I pieced together these revelations, I realized that Grace had orchestrated an elaborate deception. She had isolated Benjamin from his normal support network, controlled his access to professional advice, and potentially influenced his physical and mental state during his most vulnerable period. If she had succeeded in manipulating his will, she stood to inherit everything while leaving his actual family with nothing. But I also knew that Benjamin was not a foolish man who could be easily manipulated. He had built his success through careful planning, attention to detail, and an ability to see through people's true motivations. If Grace thought she had outsmarted him, she was probably underestimating the man who had survived 48 years of marriage to me. The next morning, I decided to take action. I called Alexander and asked him to meet me for coffee, just the two of us, to discuss some family matters. I could hear the strain in his voice as he agreed to come over. Benjamin's death had hit him hard, and now he was trying to balance his grief with the practical necessities of settling his father's estate. When Alexander arrived, he looked exhausted and older than his 38 years. The loss of his father had aged him, and I could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Grace had not come with him, which was unusual since she had been accompanying him everywhere since the funeral. "Mom," Alexander said as we sat in the garden with our coffee, "I need to talk to you about Dad's will." "Andy?" My heart started beating faster, but I kept my expression neutral. "Of course, sweetheart." "What about it?" Alexander looked uncomfortable, like he was about to deliver bad news that he did not want to share. "Grace and I met with Dad's new lawyer yesterday. There are some things about the will that are going to be difficult to understand." "What kind of things?" I asked, though I was already beginning to suspect what he was going to tell me. Alexander took a deep breath and looked down at his hands. "Mom, according to the will, Grace inherits the house, the business, and most of Dad's assets. You get a small monthly allowance, but the bulk of the estate goes to her, not to me or to you." The words confirmed my worst fears, but I had been preparing for this revelation. "That seems unusual," I said calmly. "Your father always told me that he wanted to make sure you and I were taken care of if something happened to him." Alexander nodded miserably. "I know, Mom. It does not make sense to me either." But Grace explained that Dad had been worried about tax implications and estate planning complications. She said he decided that putting everything in her name would be the most efficient way to keep the assets in the family, while minimizing legal problems. I could see that Alexander was struggling to understand this situation, trying to reconcile his knowledge of his father. With this unexpected development, Grace had clearly prepared a plausible explanation for why Benjamin would leave everything to her, an explanation that played on Alexander's trust in both his father and his wife. "Alexander," I said gently, "did you know that your father never actually consulted with his regular attorney about changing his will?" Alexander looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" I told him about my conversations with Morris, Patricia, and James. As I shared what I had learned, I could see Alexander's expression change from confusion to concern to growing anger. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, and the picture they formed was not pretty. "Are you saying that Grace somehow tricked Dad into changing his will?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I am saying that there are a lot of questions that need answers," I replied carefully. "And I think we need to investigate this situation more thoroughly before we accept that your father really intended to leave his entire life's work to someone he had only known for 3 years." Alexander was quiet for a long time, processing this information. I could see him mentally reviewing Grace's behavior during Benjamin's illness, reconsidering conversations and decisions that had seemed innocent at the time. The man I had raised to be honest and principled was beginning to see the possibility that he had been deceived by the woman he loved. "What do you think we should do?" Alexander asked finally. I took his hands in mine and looked directly into his eyes, the same brown eyes he had inherited from his father. "I think we need to find out the truth about your father's death and his will. And I think we need to be very careful about how we go about it. Because if Grace is capable of what I suspect, she is not going to give up easily." Over the next week, Alexander and I began our investigation into Grace's background and her activities during Benjamin's final months. What we discovered was far more disturbing than either of us had anticipated. I started by hiring a private investigator named Madison, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes and family disputes. Madison was in her 50s, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. When I explained our situation, she listened carefully and asked pointed questions that showed she had handled similar cases before. "Mrs. Natalie," Madison said after I finished telling her about Grace's threats and the suspicious will, "what you are describing sounds like a classic case of elder financial abuse. These situations are more common than people realize, and they often involve family members or caregivers who gain the victim's trust before exploiting them." Madison agreed to investigate Grace's background, her financial situation, and her activities during Benjamin's illness. She warned me that this type of investigation could take weeks or even months, and that we needed to be careful not to alert Grace to our suspicions while the investigation was ongoing. Meanwhile, Alexander struggled with the realization that his wife might have manipulated and possibly even harmed his father. He was torn between his love for Grace and his growing suspicions about her true nature. The stress of this situation was affecting his work, his sleep, and his ability to function normally. "Mom," Alexander said during one of our secret meetings, "I keep thinking about all the times Grace insisted on being alone with Dad during his illness. She said she was protecting him from stress. But what if she was actually isolating him so she could influence him without anyone else around?" I'd been thinking about the same thing. Grace's control over Benjamin's environment during his final weeks had been nearly complete. She had managed his medications, prepared his food, screened his phone calls, and limited his visitors. If she had wanted to manipulate him or even harm him, she would have had countless opportunities. 3 weeks into our investigation, Madison called me with disturbing news. "Natalie, I have been looking into Grace's background, and there are some serious red flags. First of all, most of her story about growing up wealthy in Kentucky appears to be fabricated. I can find no record of her family owning a horse farm, and there is no evidence that she attended the private schools she claims." Madison continued. "More importantly, this is not the first time Grace has been involved in a suspicious inheritance situation. 5 years ago, she was married to an elderly man named Harold in Ohio. Harold died suddenly after a brief illness, leaving Grace as the primary beneficiary of his will. Harold's adult children contested the will, claiming that Grace had manipulated their father, but they were unable to prove fraud and Grace inherited everything. This news hit me like a physical blow. Grace was not just an opportunistic daughter-in-law who had taken advantage of a single situation. She was apparently a serial predator who targeted vulnerable older men for their wealth. There is more, Madison said. Grace's first husband, Harold, died under circumstances very similar to Benjamin's situation. Harold had been healthy and active until Grace began caring for him during what she described as a sudden illness. He declined rapidly over a period of weeks, and Grace was the only person with him when he died. No autopsy was performed, and Harold was cremated immediately after his death. The parallels between Harold's death and Benjamin's were terrifying. Both men had been wealthy, both had been isolated by Grace during their final illness, both had died with Grace as their only witness, and both had been cremated quickly without thorough medical examination. If Grace had murdered Harold, she had used the exact same method to kill Benjamin. I shared Madison's findings with Alexander, and watching his face as I told him about Grace's previous husband was heartbreaking. The woman he loved and trusted had potentially murdered his father and at least one other man. Alexander's world was collapsing, but I could see his resolve strengthening as he began to understand the full scope of Grace's deception. "We have to stop her," Alexander said, his voice hard with determination. "If she killed Dad and this Harold person, she will probably try to do it again. We cannot let her get away with this." But stopping Grace would not be simple. She had covered her tracks carefully, and proving that she had committed murder would be extremely difficult without physical evidence. The wills in both cases appeared to be legally valid, even if they had been obtained through manipulation. Grace had been careful to present herself as a loving caregiver rather than a predatory criminal. Madison warned us that we needed concrete evidence of wrongdoing before we could take any legal action. "Suspicions and coincidences are not enough to build a criminal case," she explained. "We need proof that Grace either forged documents, coerced Benjamin into changing his will, or actively harmed him. Without that proof, she will inherit everything and walk away free to do this to another family." Over the next month, Madison and I worked together to gather evidence while Alexander tried to maintain a normal relationship with Grace. This was incredibly difficult for him, as he had to pretend to love and trust a woman who had likely murdered his father. But we knew that if Grace suspected we were investigating her, she would probably disappear before we could prove anything. Alexander's acting ability was tested every day as he came home to Grace and pretended that everything was normal. Grace, for her part, was playing the role of the grieving daughter-in-law while making plans for her inheritance. She talked about renovating the house, expanding the business, and making investments that would secure their future together. She acts like Dad's death was the best thing that ever happened to her, Alexander told me privately. She is already planning to sell his workshop and turn it into a yoga studio. She wants to get rid of all his tools and equipment, everything that represented his life's work. Meanwhile, Madison continued digging into Grace's background and her recent activities. She discovered that Grace had significant debts that she had hidden from Alexander, including credit card bills, personal loans, and money owed to some very dangerous people. Grace's expensive lifestyle had been funded by borrowed money, and she was facing serious consequences if she could not pay her creditors soon. This financial pressure provided a clear motive for Grace's actions. She had not married Alexander for love, but because Benjamin's wealth represented a solution to her financial problems. When Benjamin's natural death did not happen quickly enough, Grace had apparently decided to accelerate the process. Madison also found evidence that Grace had researched estate planning extensively before Benjamin's illness, including information about how to influence elderly people's legal decisions and how to avoid detection when manipulating someone's will. Grace's computer history revealed searches for topics like undetectable poisons, elder manipulation techniques, and how to contest a will. The most damning evidence came when Madison discovered that Grace had purchased several substances online that could cause symptoms similar to Benjamin's final illness. These substances were not technically poisons, but they could cause weakness, confusion, and organ failure if administered over time in small doses. Natalie, Madison said when she shared this information with me, I believe we have enough evidence to go to the police. Grace's pattern of behavior, her financial motive, her research into harmful substances, and the suspicious circumstances of Benjamin's death all point to murder. The question is whether the authorities will be willing to investigate a case where the victim has already been cremated. Before we went to the police, I wanted to give Grace one chance to confess and make things right. I knew this was risky, but I also knew that Benjamin would have wanted justice to be tempered with mercy, if possible. I decided to confront Grace directly and see how she reacted when faced with evidence of her crimes. I called Grace and asked her to meet me for lunch at a quiet restaurant where we could talk privately. Grace seemed pleased by the invitation, probably thinking that I had accepted her inheritance of Benjamin's estate and wanted to discuss practical arrangements for the future. Grace arrived at the restaurant looking elegant and confident, wearing another expensive outfit that she had probably purchased with money she had stolen from our family. She greeted me with a warm smile and a hug, playing her role as the loving daughter-in-law perfectly. Natalie, Grace said as we sat down, I am so glad you called. I have been wanting to talk to you about the future. I know this transition is difficult, but I want you to know that I plan to take good care of Benjamin's legacy. I smiled back at her and ordered a glass of wine, trying to appear relaxed and friendly. That is wonderful to hear, Grace. I have been thinking a lot about Benjamin's final weeks and how grateful I am for all the care you provided. Grace's smile brightened, and she began talking about her plans for the house and the business. She described elaborate renovation projects and expansion plans, speaking with the enthusiasm of someone who was already mentally spending money she had not yet officially inherited. As Grace talked, I watched her carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or remorse about what she had done to Benjamin. But there was nothing. She spoke about his death as if it had been a natural and inevitable event, with no awareness of the pain she had caused or the lives she had destroyed. After Grace finished describing her plans, I leaned forward and looked directly into her eyes. Grace, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Did you do something to hasten Benjamin's death? The question hung in the air between us like a bomb waiting to explode. Grace's smile faltered for just a moment, and I saw a flash of something cold and calculating in her eyes before she recovered her composure. Natalie, Grace said, her voice filled with apparent hurt and confusion. How could you ask such a terrible question? I loved Benjamin like a father. I did everything I could to help him during his illness. But I was not fooled by her performance. Grace, I know about Harold. I know about your debts. I know about the substances you purchased online. I know that you researched how to manipulate elderly people and how to make someone sick without being detected. Grace's face went white, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely afraid. She started to stand up from the table, but I reached out and grabbed her wrist. Sit down, Grace. We need to finish this conversation. Grace slowly sat back down, her eyes darting around the restaurant as if looking for an escape route. The confident, manipulative woman who had threatened me at Benjamin's funeral was suddenly just a scared criminal who had been caught. I do not know what you think you know, Grace said, but her voice was shaking now. But you are wrong about everything. Benjamin died of natural causes. I have done nothing wrong. I pulled out my phone and showed her some of the evidence that Madison had gathered. Grace's online searches, her purchases of suspicious substances, information about Harold's death, and records of her significant debts. As she looked at the evidence, I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to explain away the damning information. Here is what I think happened, I said calmly. You married Alexander because you needed money to pay your debts. When Benjamin did not die quickly enough to solve your financial problems, you decided to help nature along. You isolated him from his family and friends. You made him sick with substances you had researched, and you manipulated him into changing his will while he was weak and confused. Grace's hands were shaking now, and she could not meet my eyes. You cannot prove any of that, she whispered. Maybe not in court, I replied. But I do not have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. I just have to convince Alexander that the woman he married is a murderer who killed his father for money. At the mention of Alexander's name, Grace's fear turned to desperation. She knew that losing Alexander would mean losing her access to the inheritance and any chance of escaping the consequences of her actions. Please, Grace said, tears streaming down her face. Do not tell Alexander. I can explain everything. I can make this right. I leaned back in my chair and studied Grace's face. For the first time, she was showing me her true self, not the carefully constructed persona she had maintained for years. She was not a grieving daughter-in-law or a loving wife. She was a desperate criminal who would do anything to avoid facing justice for her crimes. How can you make this right, Grace? Can you bring Benjamin back? Can you undo the pain you have caused our family? Can you restore the trust you have destroyed? Grace wiped her eyes and tried to regain some of her composure. I can sign papers giving up my inheritance. I can leave town and never contact your family again. I can disappear and you will never have to see me again. I considered her offer. Letting Grace walk away would be the easiest solution, and it would spare Alexander the pain of learning the full truth about what his wife had done. But it would also mean that Grace would be free to find another victim, another family to destroy for her financial gain. That is not enough, I told her. You murdered my husband, Grace. You cannot just walk away from that. Grace's desperation turned to anger, and for a moment I saw the cold, calculating predator that had been hiding beneath her sweet exterior. You old fool, she hissed. You have no idea what you are dealing with. I have survived worse situations than this, and I will survive you too. The mask had finally slipped completely. Grace was no longer pretending to be anything other than what she truly was, a dangerous woman who would hurt anyone who stood in her way. Is that a threat? I asked. Grace smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. Take it however you want, but remember that I am young and healthy, while you are old and fragile. Accidents happen to elderly people all the time. I felt a chill of fear, but I also felt a surge of anger. Grace had killed my husband, stolen from my family, and now she was threatening to kill me too. But she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated me. Grace, I said, standing up from the table, you are about to learn that threatening me was the worst mistake you have ever made. I left the restaurant without another word, leaving Grace sitting alone with the evidence of her crimes spread out on the table. As I walked to my car, I could feel her watching me, probably trying to figure out what I was planning to do next. That evening, I met with Alexander in Madison to plan our next steps. Grace's confession and her threat against my life had convinced Alexander that we needed to take immediate action to stop her. Mom, Alexander said, his voice filled with anger and determination. I cannot believe I was married to a woman who killed Dad and is now threatening to kill you. We have to make sure she pays for what she has done. Madison agreed that we had enough evidence to go to the police, but she warned us that building a criminal case would take time, and Grace might try to flee or cause more harm while the investigation was ongoing. We need to be strategic about this, Madison said. If we move too quickly, Grace might panic and do something desperate. But if we wait too long, she might disappear or hurt someone else. As we discussed our options, I realized that we needed to find a way to trap Grace in her own lies and force her to confess to authorities. She was too clever to be caught through conventional investigation, but her arrogance and desperation might lead her to make mistakes that would expose her crimes. That night, I came up with a plan that would use Grace's own greed and cruelty against her. It was risky, and it would require perfect timing and execution, but I believed it would give us the evidence we needed to ensure that Grace faced justice for her crimes. Little did Grace know that her threat against my life had just sealed her fate. She was about to discover that underestimating a grandmother's determination to protect her family was a fatal mistake. The next morning, I put my plan into action. I called Grace and asked her to meet me at the house to discuss the inheritance situation. I told her that I had been thinking about our conversation at the restaurant and that I might be willing to accept her offer to disappear in exchange for keeping quiet about my suspicions. Grace agreed to meet me immediately, probably thinking that she had successfully intimidated me into submission. She had no idea that Alexander and Madison were hidden in the house with recording equipment, ready to capture whatever Grace might say when she thought she was safe. When Grace arrived, she looked confident and composed, back to her usual manipulative self. She had probably spent the night convincing herself that she could handle one frightened old woman who was in over her head. Natalie, Grace said with her fake smile, I am so glad you called. I knew you would see reason once you had time to think about our situation. I invited her into the living room, the same room where Benjamin and I had entertained friends and family for decades. The irony of confronting his killer in our family's sanctuary was not lost on me. Grace, I said, before we discuss any arrangements, I need to understand exactly what happened to Benjamin. I need to know the truth. Grace looked surprised by this request. I told you yesterday that Benjamin died of natural causes. I do not know why you keep asking these questions. But I pressed on. Grace, we are family now, and if we are going to move forward together, we need honesty between us. I know you were desperate for money. I know about Harold. I know you researched ways to make someone sick. I just need you to tell me how it happened. Grace studied my face carefully, probably trying to determine whether I was genuinely seeking understanding or setting some kind of trap. After a long moment, she seemed to decide that I was just a confused old woman who needed reassurance. Natalie, Grace said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, I think you have been listening to too many crime shows on television. Real life is not that dramatic, but I kept pushing. Please, Grace, I need to know. Did you give Benjamin something to make him sick? Did you help him die peacefully? I promise I am not judging you. I just need to understand. Grace was quiet for several minutes, weighing her options. I could see her calculating whether telling me the truth would help or hurt her position. Finally, she seemed to conclude that a partial confession might actually work in her favor. All right, Grace said, leaning forward in her chair. You want the truth? Benjamin was suffering, Natalie. He was in pain and getting worse every day. I could see that he was ready to go, but his body was not letting him die peacefully. I felt my hands start to shake, but I forced myself to remain calm. So you helped him? Grace nodded slowly. I gave him some herbal supplements that helped relax his system and ease his transition. Nothing harmful, just natural remedies that allowed his body to let go when it was ready. My heart was pounding, but I knew I needed her to say more. What kind of supplements, Grace? Grace seemed to be warming to her story now, probably convinced that she was manipulating me into accepting her version of events. Just some digitalis extract to help with his heart palpitations, and some other natural compounds that eased his breathing difficulties. Everything I gave him was derived from plants. It was like a gentle form of hospice care. I knew that digitalis, even in natural form, could be lethal in the wrong doses. Grace was essentially confessing to poisoning Benjamin while making it sound like a mercy killing. And the will? I asked. How did you convince him to change it? Grace's confidence was growing. Natalie, Benjamin was worried about estate taxes and legal complications. I had done research on the most efficient ways to transfer wealth, and I showed him how leaving everything to me temporarily would save the family thousands of dollars in taxes and legal fees. The plan was always to transfer everything to you and Alexander after the estate was settled. This was a complete lie, of course, but Grace was spinning it with the skill of someone who had probably told similar stories before. So you were going to give us everything back? I asked, playing along with her deception. Of course, Grace said smoothly. I love Alexander and I would never want to hurt his family. The inheritance arrangement was just a temporary legal strategy. I nodded, as if this explanation made sense. Grace, I appreciate you being honest with me. It makes me feel so much better to understand what really happened. Grace smiled, clearly pleased that her manipulation was working. I am glad we could clear this up, Natalie. I was worried that you might misunderstand the situation. Now came the crucial moment. I needed to get Grace to reveal her true intentions and her threats against me. Grace, I said, yesterday at the restaurant you seemed upset when I asked these questions. You said some things that frightened me. Grace's expression hardened slightly. What kinds of things? You mentioned that accidents happen to elderly people. That sounded like you were threatening me. Grace was quiet for a moment, probably trying to remember exactly what she had said and how it might sound on a recording. But her arrogance got the better of her caution. Natalie, Grace said, her voice taking on a cold edge, I was not threatening you. I was simply pointing out that you are in a vulnerable position. You are alone now, with no one to protect you. If you try to cause problems for me or spread lies about what happened to Benjamin, you might find yourself in a dangerous situation. What kind of dangerous situation? I pressed. Grace leaned forward, her fake sweetness completely gone now. The kind where an elderly widow has a fatal accident in her own home, falls downstairs, slips in the bathtub, takes the wrong medication by mistake. These things happen all the time, and no one ever suspects anything. The confession was even more damning than I had hoped. Grace had just admitted to murdering Benjamin and threatened to kill me in the same way. So if I do not keep quiet about what you did to Benjamin, you will kill me too? I asked, wanting to make sure her threat was absolutely clear on the recording. Grace smiled coldly. I would never hurt you, Natalie, but I cannot control what accidents might happen if you force me to protect myself and my future with Alexander. At that moment, Alexander stepped out of his hiding place behind the bookshelf, his face white with shock and rage. Grace spun around, her eyes wide with terror as she realized she had been trapped. Hello, Grace, Alexander said, his voice deadly calm. Thank you for explaining exactly how you murdered my father and how you plan to murder my mother. Grace jumped up from her chair, looking frantically around the room for an escape route. Alexander, you do not understand. Your mother tricked me into saying those things. I was not being serious, but Alexander was not fooled. Grace, I heard every word. You confessed to poisoning my father with digitalis. You admitted to manipulating his will, and you just threatened to kill my mother if she exposes you. Madison emerged from her hiding place as well, holding a professional recording device. Mrs. Grace, I am Madison Cooper, a private investigator. Everything you just said has been recorded and will be turned over to the police as evidence. Grace's composure finally cracked completely. She started screaming, denying everything she had just confessed, claiming that we had entrapped her and that her statements would not. Hold up in court, you cannot do this to me, Grace shrieked. I have rights. You tricked me into saying those things. Alexander pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Yes, I need to report a murder confession. The suspect is here now and has also threatened to kill another family member. As we waited for the police to arrive, Grace made one last desperate attempt to manipulate the situation. She fell to her knees in front of Alexander, crying and begging for forgiveness. Alexander, please, she sobbed. I love you. I made mistakes, but I love you. We can work this out. We can get counseling and start over." Alexander looked down at his wife with a mixture of disgust and pity. "Grace, you murdered my father for money. You were planning to kill my mother." There is no coming back from that. When the police arrived, they found Grace in full breakdown mode, alternately denying everything and trying to justify her actions. The officers listened to the recording Madison had made, read the evidence we had gathered about Grace's background and her suspicious purchases, and placed her under arrest for murder and making terroristic threats. As Grace was led away in handcuffs, she turned back one last time to look at Alexander. As Grace was led away in handcuffs, she turned back one last time to look at Alexander. "You will regret this," she screamed. "I could have made you rich and powerful. Now you will have nothing." Alexander watched his wife being taken away, his face sad but resolute. "I would rather have nothing than have blood money from my father's murder," he said quietly. Over the next several months, the case against Grace moved through the legal system. The district attorney was able to build a strong case based on her recorded confession, her pattern of suspicious behavior, and the evidence Madison had gathered about her previous crimes. Grace initially tried to claim that her confession had been coerced and that she had been entrapped into making incriminating statements. But her recorded threats against my life, combined with the evidence of her research into harmful substances and her financial motive, painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. The investigation into Benjamin's death was reopened, and while his body had been cremated, investigators were able to find traces of digitalis in some of his personal belongings. Grace had been careless in her disposal of the evidence, leaving residue on items she had handled while caring for him. More damaging to Grace's case was the discovery that she had used the same methods to kill Harold, her previous husband. Investigators in Ohio reopened that case as well, and Harold's children provided testimony about Grace's suspicious behavior. Before their father's death, Grace eventually accepted a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Benjamin's murder, with additional sentences for elder abuse, fraud, and making terroristic threats. She would never again have the opportunity to prey on vulnerable people. The legal resolution of Grace's crimes allowed Alexander and me to begin healing from the trauma she had inflicted on our family. Benjamin's real will was located in his attorney's safe, confirming that he had intended to leave his estate to Alexander and me, not to Grace. The forged will that Grace had created was declared invalid, and Benjamin's true wishes were honored. Alexander struggled with guilt and anger for months after Grace's arrest. He blamed himself for bringing her into our family and for not seeing through her deception sooner. It took extensive counseling and the support of friends and family to help him understand that he had been the victim of a sophisticated predator, not a foolish man who had failed to protect his father. "Mom," Alexander said one evening as we sat in Benjamin's workshop, which we had decided to preserve exactly as he had left it, "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed. Grace's interest in Dad's finances, her insistence on being his caregiver, the way she isolated him from his friends. How did I not see what was happening?" I took his hand and looked into his eyes, seeing Benjamin's wisdom and kindness reflected there. "Son, Grace was a professional manipulator who had practiced her skills on at least one other victim. She knew exactly how to present herself as a loving wife and daughter-in-law while hiding her true nature. You saw what she wanted you to see because you loved her and trusted her." Alexander nodded, but I could see he was still struggling with self-forgiveness. "I just wish I could have protected Dad somehow." "Alexander," I said firmly, "your father would not want you to blame yourself for what Grace did. I loved you completely, and he would want you to learn from this experience and use it to help other people avoid similar situations." And that is exactly what Alexander decided to do. He began specializing in elder law and financial abuse cases, using his legal skills to help other families who had been victimized by predators like Grace. His work became a way of honoring his father's memory and ensuring that Benjamin's death would lead to something positive. As for me, I found my own way to turn this tragedy into something meaningful. I began speaking to community groups about the warning signs of elder financial abuse, sharing our story to help other families recognize and prevent similar crimes. I also established a foundation in Benjamin's name to provide legal assistance to elderly people who had been victimized by financial predators. 6 months after Grace's conviction, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from Harold's daughter in Ohio, thanking me for reopening the investigation into Grace's crimes. "Mrs. Natalie," she said, "my family never gave up believing that Grace had murdered our father, but we could never prove it. When your case brought new evidence to light, it finally gave us the justice we had been seeking for 5 years. My father can rest in peace now, knowing that his killer will never hurt another family." This conversation reminded me that our fight against Grace had been about more than just our own family. By stopping her, we had prevented her from finding new victims and had brought closure to other families she had already harmed. 2 years after Benjamin's death, Alexander met a wonderful woman named Chloe, a teacher at the elementary school where he sometimes volunteered for legal education programs. Chloe was everything Grace had pretended to be: genuine, kind, honest, and truly interested in building a life with Alexander, rather than exploiting him for financial gain. When Alexander brought Chloe home to meet me, I could see immediately that this relationship was based on real love and mutual respect. Chloe was curious about Benjamin's workshop, interested in our family stories, and clearly devoted to Alexander's happiness rather than his bank account. Alexander and Chloe were married in a small ceremony in our backyard, surrounded by the people who truly cared about them. It was a healing moment for our family, proof that love and trust could survive even after being so brutally betrayed. As I watched Alexander dance with Chloe at their wedding reception, I thought about how different this celebration was from his wedding to Grace. This time the joy was genuine, the love was real, and the future looked bright instead of ominous. Benjamin would have loved Chloe, and I knew he would have been proud of the man Alexander had become through surviving this ordeal. The experience had made Alexander more cautious and wiser, but it had not made him cynical or unable to love again. 3 years after Benjamin's death, Chloe gave birth to our first grandchild, a beautiful baby boy they named Benjamin in honor of his grandfather. Holding little Benjamin for the first time, I felt a profound sense of completion and healing. Grace had tried to destroy our family legacy, but instead she had made us stronger and more grateful for the love we shared. Benjamin's memory lived on not just in the grandchild who bore his name, but in the work Alexander was doing to protect other families. The foundation I had established, and the deeper appreciation we all had for honesty and integrity. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the way I handled Grace's threats. They wonder if I should have gone to the police immediately instead of trying to get a confession first. But I believe that Benjamin would have approved of giving Grace a chance to confess and show remorse before facing the full consequences of her crimes. Grace chose to respond to that opportunity with more threats and manipulation, proving that she was not capable of redemption. Her own words sealed her fate, and I have no regrets about the role I played in bringing her to justice. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that evil can wear a beautiful mask, but truth and love are always stronger in the end. Grace nearly succeeded in her plan because she was skilled at deception and manipulation, but she failed because she underestimated the power of family loyalty and the determination of a mother protecting her child. Benjamin always told me that the best revenge against evil is to live a good life, filled with love and purpose. Grace thought she could destroy our family and steal our legacy, but instead she gave us the opportunity to become stronger, more compassionate, and more committed to helping others. Today, our house is filled with laughter again. Little Benjamin takes his first steps in the same garden where his grandfather grew prize-winning roses. Alexander and Chloe come for dinner every Sunday, and we share stories about the man whose love continues to guide our family even after his death. Grace sits in a prison cell, facing the consequences of her choices, while we continue to build the legacy that Benjamin worked so hard to create. She thought she was so clever, manipulating an old man and threatening an elderly widow, but she learned too late that a grandmother's love is a force more powerful than any criminal scheme. Sometimes justice comes from the courtroom, and sometimes it comes from the courage of ordinary people who refuse to let evil triumph. In our case, it came from both, and I am grateful for every day we have been given to honor Benjamin's memory and protect the family he loved so much. As I sit on our porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and remembering all the conversations Benjamin and I shared in this same spot, I feel at peace. Grace may have cut his life short, but she could not diminish the impact he had on everyone who knew him. His legacy lives on in Alexander's work, in our foundation, in little Benjamin's laughter, and in the love that continues to bind our family together. That is my story of how a daughter-in-law's greed and cruelty brought out the strength I never knew I had. Grace thought she could intimidate me into silence, but she discovered that threatening a family's future is the one thing that will turn a gentle grandmother into a fierce protector. I hope my story inspires you to trust your instincts when something feels wrong, to investigate rather than ignore suspicious behavior, and to never underestimate the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully planned deception. And remember, family is worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle might be. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to deal with someone who tried to manipulate or harm your family? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to tell me what city you are watching from. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end, and I will see you in the next video.